The billionaire sat quietly at his table, pretending to be blind. He left $2,000 on the table to test the new waitress, but what she did next left him absolutely speechless and shocked. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The evening shift at Marcello's had been relentless. Sarah had been working at the upscale Italian restaurant for exactly 42 days. She kept meticulous count, and her feet ached in ways that seemed to penetrate deeper than her bones. The dinner crowd had finally begun to thin, leaving behind the echo of clinking glasses and the fading aroma of truffle oil and garlic. She retied her apron sash, smoothed a strand of auburn hair that had escaped her neat ponytail, and approached the corner table where a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit sat motionless behind dark sunglasses. Something about him was different. Most customers who came to Marcello's fell into predictable categories: wealthy businessmen preoccupied with their phones, couples celebrating anniversaries, and the occasional tourist trying to impress a date with their selection of wine. But this man possessed a stillness that suggested power held in reserve, like a predator at rest. He hadn't checked his phone once. He simply sat, listening, observing. Sarah had noticed him the moment he'd been seated. Her survival instincts, honed by years of reading people to anticipate their needs, had flagged him immediately. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice professional but warm. She'd perfected this tone over countless shifts, present but not intrusive, friendly but not presumptuous. "May I get you something to drink?" The man turned his head toward her voice with precise intentionality. "Water, room temperature, a slice of lemon." "No ice," he said, his voice deep and measured with the cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Of course," Sarah replied, noting the specific preferences in her practiced memory. She'd learned early that attention to detail was the difference between adequate service, and exceptional service meant better tips, which meant survival. When she returned with his water, room temperature, fresh lemon, no ice, he'd already ordered from the menu, apparently having decided in the brief moments of her absence. Linguine alle vongole, the house wine, focaccia bread with olive oil instead of butter, again each order precise and deliberate. Throughout his meal, Sarah observed him. He ate methodically, paused frequently to listen to the ambient sounds of the restaurant, the murmur of conversation, the soft classical music emanating from hidden speakers, the distant clink of dishes from the kitchen. Occasionally his hand would move to his face, and he'd adjust his sunglasses, but his head would remain perfectly still, his posture impeccable. There was something off about him, though she couldn't quite articulate it. Something performative, though not in an aggressive way. It wasn't until she cleared his plate, which he'd cleaned with evident satisfaction, that Sarah noticed the bills on the table. 10 $100 bills lay beside the empty water glass, arranged with mathematical precision in a straight line. $2,000 for a meal that had cost approximately $80. Her heart quickened. Her mind began its familiar calculation, the one it conducted dozens of times daily. What was the catch? What did this mean? In her experience, such generosity always came with invisible strings attached, conditions that would become clear only when it was too late to protect herself. "Will there be anything else, sir?" she asked, her hand trembling slightly as she gestured toward the bills. She didn't touch them, not yet. First, she needed to understand the nature of this test. "That's a generous tip for excellent service," the man said. His expression remained neutral, unreadable. "It's yours or it's not. That's entirely your decision." And there it was. The moment of reckoning she'd somehow sensed was coming from the instant she'd approached his table. Sarah stood motionless for a moment, the weight of his expectation pressing against her like a physical force. She could take the money. $2,000 would change her circumstances substantially. It would mean one less shift, perhaps a day off to spend with her ailing mother. It would mean a new battery for her car, which had been making concerning sounds lately. It would mean breathing room, however temporary, in a life that allowed for very little. But something in his stillness, in the unspoken weight of his question, because it was a question, regardless of his phrasing, told her this wasn't about the money at all. This was about testing her character, her honesty, her integrity. The businessman wanted to know if she would simply pocket a sum that seemed disproportionate to her service, or if she possessed the moral fortitude to question it. "I appreciate the sentiment," Sarah said carefully, choosing her words as though navigating a minefield. "But that's too much. That's more than quadruple the appropriate gratuity. I'll leave 200, which is 20% as is standard. I haven't done anything to merit this unusual amount." The man smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his entire face, softening features that had previously seemed carved from granite. "Bring me the check," he said, "and I'd like to make a reservation for tomorrow evening. Same time, I'd like you to serve me again." As Sarah walked toward the register, her hands still trembling, she realized she'd just passed some kind of test. But she had no idea what it meant or why this stranger cared whether she would steal from him. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that his casual request for a reservation would set in motion a series of events that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her entire existence. The following morning, Sarah's alarm chimed at 5:30, as it had every morning for the past 8 years. She existed in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world still belonged to those willing to wake before the sun. Her studio apartment was small, 600 square feet of cramped living space in a neighborhood where neighbors didn't ask questions and landlords rarely asked about tenant references, but it was hers, paid for through honest work and careful budgeting. She made coffee in the ancient coffee maker that had belonged to her grandmother, boiled an egg, and reviewed her schedule for the day. 2 shifts at Marcello's that evening, which would bring her to 9 shifts for the week. 9 shifts meant overtime pay, which meant she could contribute an extra $200 toward her mother's medical expenses. Her mother, Catherine, suffered from early-onset Alzheimer's disease. Sarah's father had left them both 15 years ago, citing irreconcilable differences. Code, Sarah had come to understand, for his unwillingness to acknowledge her mother's initial symptoms or contribute to her care. Caring for her mother fell entirely to Sarah, not legally, not officially, but in every way that mattered. Catherine lived in an assisted living facility 45 minutes away, a modest but clean establishment that accepted Sarah's quarterly payments without question. Quarterly, because Sarah could only afford to pay 3 months at a time, always living paycheck to paycheck, always uncertain whether the next crisis would derail her entire, carefully constructed system. The strange man from the previous evening had requested her specifically, and this fact played through Sarah's mind as she prepared for her shifts. Most customers didn't remember their servers. They looked through them, past them, sometimes at them, but rarely truly saw them. This man, with his dark sunglasses and his precise orders and his test of her character, he had seen her, or at least he wanted to see her. The distinction mattered. The evening shift began with the familiar rhythm of preparation, polishing silverware, folding napkins into precise triangles, straightening place settings that didn't need straightening. Marcello's maintained high standards, and the staff respected the protocols that ensured the restaurant's reputation for excellence. At exactly 7 o'clock, the same time he'd arrived the previous evening, the man entered the restaurant. The hostess, Marie, recognized him and guided him to the same corner table without asking whether he had a reservation. Apparently, he'd already called ahead. "Welcome back," Sarah said, approaching the table with her practiced grace. "The same, I presume? Water, room temperature, lemon, no ice?" "You remembered," he said, and something in his voice suggested this pleased him enormously. "But tonight I'd like to discuss the menu with you. I want your honest recommendation. What's exceptional tonight?" Sarah paused. Most customers asked this question expecting flattery about every dish, but this man's phrasing, honest recommendation, suggested he wanted truth, not marketing. She thought carefully about the evening's specials, considering not just what was objectively excellent, but what might genuinely suit his palate based on his previous order. "The veal piccata is exceptional," she said, "but the linguine alle vongole that you ordered yesterday, we have fresh clams from this morning, locally sourced. If you enjoyed it last night, you'll find it's even better tonight. The preparation is identical, but the ingredient quality fluctuates daily. Today was a superior day for our supplier." He leaned back slightly, and she realized he was smiling again. "This is why I requested you specifically," he said. "You don't simply tell customers what will generate the largest bill. You're thinking about their actual satisfaction. It's a quality I find increasingly rare." Throughout the meal, they spoke intermittently, brief conversations interspersed with her attention to other tables. He asked about her family, her aspirations, her life circumstances. Sarah found herself answering honestly, something she rarely did with customers. She told him about her mother, about the medical expenses, about her dreams of someday opening a small bookstore cafe where people could gather to discuss literature and ideas. "That's beautiful," he said when she'd finished describing her vision. "And entirely achievable with the right resources and planning. You should pursue it." "Resources are something I lack considerably," Sarah replied, with the gentle humor that helped her cope with her circumstances. "But I appreciate the encouragement. It's the kind of dream that sustains you on difficult nights." When the check came, she presented it with her standard professional demeanor, not expecting any unusual behavior. But when she cleared the table, another stack of bills awaited, but this time the amount was appropriate, exactly 20%, correct to the dollar. He was no longer testing her. He was treating her as he would treat any server who'd provided attentive service. "I'd like to reserve tomorrow evening as well," he said as she prepared to leave. "And I'd like to know your name, properly, not just as printed on your name tag." "Sarah Mitchell," she said, "and I'll be here tomorrow." For the next 2 weeks, the man, who finally introduced himself as Marcus Sterling on their 4th evening together, returned to Marcello's without exception. He never deviated from his 7 o'clock reservation. He never ordered anything other than wine, paired with carefully considered Italian dishes. And most remarkably, he never touched his phone. In an era where most wealthy individuals treated their devices as external organs, Marcus's indifference was extraordinary. Sarah's life began to reorganize itself around these encounters. She requested specific shifts to ensure she'd be working when Marcus arrived. Her co-workers noticed the change in her demeanor, the way her exhaustion seemed to lift during those particular evenings. They teased her gently, assuming she'd developed a romantic interest. Sarah neither confirmed nor denied their assumptions. She simply allowed the mystery to persist. What was happening between her and Marcus existed in a space that defied easy categorization. He wasn't a customer in the traditional sense. He was becoming something closer to a confidant. Each evening, as the restaurant quieted and she could steal a few moments to sit at his table between her other obligations, they would talk. She learned that he was a self-made billionaire. He'd inherited nothing, which somehow made his wealth seem less obscene, more earned. He'd started with a technology company in his 20s, sold it for an enormous sum, and then spent the subsequent years acquiring, building, and sometimes dismantling other companies. His public reputation was formidable and somewhat feared. Business reporters described him as ruthless and uncompromising. Yet the man seated across from her, listening intently to her stories about her mother's disease and her financial struggles, bore no resemblance to that public persona. "Why do you keep coming back?" Sarah asked on the 10th evening, her curiosity finally overriding her professional caution. Surely you don't need to eat at this restaurant repeatedly. You could dine anywhere in the city. You could dine anywhere in the world. Marcus removed his sunglasses. He'd stopped wearing them after the third evening, revealing eyes of striking blue, and regarded her with an expression of complete sincerity. I keep coming back because, in my experience, people of genuine character are increasingly rare. You passed my test that first night. Since then, you've continued to demonstrate that your integrity isn't situational. You could easily accept increasingly inappropriate behavior from me, justify it as a wealthy eccentric's harmless eccentricity. Instead, you've maintained appropriate boundaries while also treating me with kindness. That combination is exceedingly valuable. Is that why you kept testing me? Sarah asked, understanding finally the pattern behind his apparent generosity. I test everyone, he admitted. It's a habit born from necessity. When you have as much money as I do, people want things from you. They lie, manipulate, and perform endless variations of false self to gain access to your resources. The first test was genuinely about honesty. The subsequent time we've spent together has been about confirming that your character is consistent, not situational. And what have you concluded? Sarah's heart beat irregularly as she waited for his response. That I'd like to help you, Marcus said simply. I'd like to assist with your mother's care. I'd like to invest in your bookstore cafe vision, not as charity, but as an investment in your future and tangentially in my own. Sarah's immediate instinct was to refuse. Her pride, fierce and protective, recoiled at the idea of accepting money from this man, however kind he seemed. But another part of her, the part that understood her mother's disease was progressive, that her savings would eventually prove inadequate, recognized that this might be the opportunity that changed everything. I need to think about it, she said finally, and I need to understand your intentions more fully. When you say investment, what exactly do you mean? Dinner, Marcus replied. Not here at the restaurant where we're always interrupted. Proper dinner. Tomorrow evening, my penthouse. 7 o'clock. We'll discuss everything thoroughly. Every instinct Sarah possessed screamed warnings. This was how stories turned dark. This was how vulnerable women became victims of men who seemed too good to be true because they actually were. And yet, something about Marcus, some fundamental honesty that she could sense the way she sensed whether a customer was genuinely happy or simply performing happiness, made her trust him. Okay, she said, tomorrow, 7 o'clock. Marcus's penthouse occupied the top floor of a building in the financial district. It was, unsurprisingly, exactly what Sarah would have imagined if she'd allowed herself to imagine such spaces. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, revealing thousands of lights twinkling against the darkening sky. The furniture was sparse and modern, suggesting someone who valued simplicity over ostentation. Art hung on the walls, authentic pieces, she suspected, not reproductions, depicting scenes of great emotional complexity. He'd prepared dinner himself, which surprised her. I'm not completely helpless, he said when she commented on this fact. Wealth doesn't absolve me of learning basic survival skills. I actually enjoy cooking. They ate at a dining table that could have seated 20 but was set for 2. The meal was simple, a perfectly seared scallop, fresh vegetables, risotto prepared with obvious care. The wine was exceptional, and the conversation flowed with the ease of two people who'd already established genuine rapport. Tell me about your mother, Marcus said as they finished the main course. Before the disease, who was she? Sarah found herself describing her mother in ways she rarely did, not as a collection of symptoms or medical costs, but as a complete person. Her mother had been a librarian, passionate about connecting people with the right books at the right moments in their lives. She'd been witty, fierce in her protectiveness of her daughter, and deeply kind. Alzheimer's was slowly erasing the woman she'd been, replacing her with someone increasingly lost in her own mind. How much would it cost to provide her with superior care? Marcus asked. Not just basic assisted living, but genuine companionship, activity programming, medical specialists focused on slowing her cognitive decline. More than I'll ever earn, Sarah said quietly. But not more than I can provide, Marcus replied. Here's what I'm proposing. I'll assume all financial responsibility for your mother's care. She'll be transferred to an excellent facility I have a relationship with. They specialize in early-onset Alzheimer's cases. Additionally, I'll fund the development of your bookstore cafe. But this comes with conditions. Sarah's entire body tensed. Here it was, the moment when the other shoe dropped, when the trap revealed itself. I want you to work for me, Marcus continued, not as a server, but as a consultant. I'm developing a new business venture focused on hospitality and community building. Your insights into human nature, your ability to genuinely care for people while maintaining boundaries, your understanding of what makes spaces feel welcoming. These are all valuable skills. The position comes with a competitive salary and benefits. You'd be building something meaningful rather than simply serving people. It was a brilliant offer. It was also terrifying. Why? Sarah asked. This is too much. You've known me for 2 weeks. I've known you for 2 weeks, Marcus agreed, but I've observed you intensely during that time. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent my entire adult life pursuing wealth and power and the acquisitions that accompany them. What I've discovered is that none of it fills the void that remains. You represent something I've never prioritized: genuine human connection, integrity, the capacity to care for others despite your own struggles. I'm not proposing to rescue you, Sarah. I'm proposing to build something together, a life where both of us are moving towards something rather than away from something. This sounds like you want a relationship, Sarah said carefully. I do, Marcus admitted, but not a transactional one. Not a situation where you owe me because I've paid for your mother's care or funded your business. I want you to choose to be in my life because you genuinely want to be here, not because circumstance has left you with limited options. Sarah spent the night in the guest bedroom of his penthouse, a vast space with a view of the city that made her feel simultaneously insignificant and capable of anything. She didn't sleep. Instead, she called her mother at the facility. It was 3 a.m, but they answered because she was a regular caller, a daughter who rang even in the small hours. It's Sarah, Mom, she said quietly. Sarah, her mother repeated, her voice carrying the faint confusion that had become characteristic. Are you coming to visit? Soon, Sarah promised. I'm calling because something good might be happening. Someone kind has entered my life, and he wants to help us. I wanted to tell you because you always said I'd know when to trust someone, that I'd feel it in my body, not just in my mind. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said with surprising clarity, You were always braver than you knew, sweetheart. Choose the path that frightens you most. That's where the real living happens. By morning, Sarah had decided. When Marcus woke her with coffee and the proposal of exploring the city together, she accepted all of it. The job, the help with her mother, the possibility of something more. What she didn't yet understand was that accepting his help would eventually require her to see past carefully constructed illusions and confront truths about Marcus that would challenge everything she believed about him. 3 months into her employment and her relationship with Marcus, Sarah believed she'd found something approaching happiness. Her mother was thriving in her new facility, receiving specialized care and engaging in memory stimulation activities that seemed to slow her cognitive decline. Sarah's salary, astonishingly generous, allowed her to rent a proper apartment, purchase reliable transportation, and actually save money. The bookstore cafe project was in advanced planning stages, with Marcus consulting with architects and financial advisors about locations and startup costs. The business venture Marcus had hired her for was developing beautifully. They spent their workdays together, designing a concept called The Gathering Place, a series of community-focused spaces where individuals could connect, learn, and belong. Sarah brought her understanding of what made people feel welcomed. Marcus brought capital and business acumen. Together, they were creating something genuinely innovative. But there was a darkness beneath the surface that Sarah occasionally sensed but didn't fully acknowledge. Marcus seemed to carry emotional weight that he carefully concealed. He woke sometimes from nightmares that he wouldn't discuss. He had complex relationships with his family that he deflected whenever she asked directly. And there were moments when his coldness returned, when he'd shift into the ruthless businessman the tabloids described, making decisions that affected thousands of people with the detached efficiency of someone playing chess with human lives. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when Sarah encountered an article on Marcus's computer. The headline read, "Sterling Technologies' hostile acquisition results in mass layoffs, 500 employees lose positions." The article detailed how Marcus had acquired a mid-sized software company, restructured it, eliminated redundancies, and sold it at significant profit within 6 months. For those 500 employees, the acquisition meant the loss of their livelihoods. The article included interviews with devastated workers, families unable to pay mortgages, children pulled from schools. Sarah's hands shook as she read. She felt physically ill. This was the Marcus she'd heard rumors about, but had convinced herself was exaggerated. The ruthless billionaire willing to destroy lives for profit. "I can explain," Marcus said from the doorway. She hadn't heard him enter the office. "Can you?" Sarah's voice came out cold, foreign to her own ears. "Explain how you can speak about building communities and creating spaces of belonging, while simultaneously destroying people's lives for profit margins. Those were 500 real people, Marcus. 500 families affected by your business decisions." "Yes," Marcus said simply, "and I'll stand by every decision I made." The company was bleeding financially. If I hadn't restructured it, it would have failed entirely, resulting in the loss of even more jobs. The employees I retained are now part of a thriving organization with actual stability. The ones I let go received severance packages and outplacement services significantly more generous than they would have received if the company had collapsed. "That doesn't make it ethical," Sarah said. "No," Marcus agreed, "but neither does it make it evil. Business operates under different moral calculus than personal relationships. I never pretended to be a saint, Sarah. I pretended to be exactly what I am, someone trying to build wealth and power in a system that rewards those pursuits. The version of me that exists in the world of commerce isn't the same version that exists in your presence." "That's split personality," Sarah said. "That's being two different people." "Is it?" Marcus moved closer and Sarah instinctively stepped back. "Or is it simply accepting that we're all complex, that we contain multitudes, that different contexts bring out different aspects of our character? You're not the same person at Marcello's as you are with your mother. You're not the same person with me in private as you are in public. We all perform different versions of ourselves for different audiences. There's a difference between context-appropriate behavior and systematic cruelty," Sarah countered. "Those people—" "I'm not cruel to those people," Marcus interrupted, his voice taking on an edge. "I'm indifferent to them. There's a crucial distinction. I don't celebrate their suffering. I simply don't allow their suffering to interfere with my business judgments. That's the cost of excellence in capitalism, Sarah. That's the price of the life you're now enjoying. You think my money appeared through moral purity? You think I built a net worth of $8 billion by prioritizing the feelings of people affected by my business decisions?" The argument escalated from there, neither of them backing down, both unwilling to compromise on fundamental principles. By the time Sarah left his office, they'd reached an impasse. She returned to her apartment and spent the night cycling through emotions: anger, disillusionment, betrayal, and something worse, the recognition that she'd allowed herself to fall in love with someone fundamentally incompatible with her values. Sarah avoided Marcus for a week. She called in sick to work. She ignored his messages. She spent her time with her mother, who seemed to sense that her daughter was suffering in ways that transcended the everyday difficulties of mortal existence. "You're thinking too much," her mother said during one visit. Catherine had good days and bad days, and this was one of her better ones, her mind relatively sharp, her words forming with clarity. "You inherited that from me. Your father had the luxury of simple thinking, moving through the world without questioning everything." "I feel like I've been making terrible decisions," Sarah said. "Like I've allowed myself to be blinded by attraction and gratitude into compromising my principles." "Have you?" her mother asked. "Or have you allowed yourself to become more complex, more nuanced in your understanding of human nature?" "The world is rarely divided into saints and sinners, Sarah. Most people are both. The question is whether they're trying to be better or become worse." Sarah didn't have an answer to that question, so when Marcus appeared at her apartment on Friday evening, he'd used the key she'd given him, entering without permission, which should have enraged her but somehow felt characteristic. She let him in. "I want to tell you something," he said without preamble, "something I've never told anyone, something that will help you understand why I made the choices I made and why I'm capable of both the kindness you've witnessed and the coldness you rightfully condemned." They sat on her small apartment sofa. Sarah braced herself for some revelation of trauma or damage that would explain away his moral flexibility. "I wasn't born into wealth," Marcus began. "My parents were ordinary middle-class people. My father was an accountant. My mother was a teacher. We lived comfortably, but without excess. When I was 16, my father was laid off. The company he'd worked for 23 years was acquired by a larger corporation, restructured, and emptied of employees deemed redundant. My father was one of them." He paused, and Sarah saw something flicker across his face. Genuine pain, long buried but never quite gone. "He was devastated," Marcus continued. "He was a man whose entire identity was bound up in his work, his competence, his usefulness. When that was taken from him, he didn't know how to exist. He took his life 6 months after the layoffs." Sarah's breath caught. She reached for his hand instinctively, but he gently pulled away, needing to finish without comfort. "I made a promise to myself that I would never be vulnerable like that again," he said. "I would never depend on an employer, never trust that my security was guaranteed. I built wealth specifically as a shield against vulnerability. And in doing that, I became the kind of man who could let others experience the vulnerability I feared so desperately. I became my father's layoff, multiplied by thousands of decisions, and I convinced myself it was justified because I had my own survival to consider." "Marcus," Sarah said softly, "that's trauma masquerading as philosophy." "I know," he replied. "I've known for years. I've been in therapy, and my therapist has said exactly what you just said. But knowing something intellectually and changing your fundamental operating system are different things. I'm still terrified. I'm still building walls. But here's what's different now. I'm trying not to be." He pulled out his phone and showed her a series of documents. Foundation papers, charitable giving records, a trust he'd established to support displaced workers, scholarships he'd created for children of workers his companies had laid off, programs designed to teach workforce development and financial literacy to communities affected by economic disruption. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Marcus said. "I'm not asking you to believe I'm a good person. I'm asking you to understand that I'm trying to be better, that I'm using my resources to mitigate damage I've caused, and that I'm genuinely attempting to change how I operate in the world. That's all anyone can do." Sarah read through the documents, her understanding of Marcus becoming exponentially more complex. He wasn't a villain with a secret charitable side. He was something much more interesting, a deeply flawed human being engaged in the painstaking process of becoming less harmful, less defensive, less afraid. "I still think what you did was wrong," she said finally. "I know," Marcus replied. "But I also think you're trying to be better," she continued, "and I think trying matters. So I'm not leaving, but I'm also not pretending this resolves everything between us. We'll need to talk about this repeatedly, probably for a long time." "I can live with that," Marcus said. And for the first time in weeks, he looked genuinely at peace. The revelation came from an unexpected source. Sarah was attending the soft opening of the first Gathering Place location, a beautiful community center designed to serve a neighborhood recovering from economic disruption. Several hundred people had come to celebrate. Community leaders, board members, donors, and residents of the surrounding area who'd been invited to experience the space. Sarah was showing a group of teenagers through the media library when an older woman approached her, her face carrying an expression of shock and recognition. "I know you," the woman said. "You worked at Marcello's, didn't you, several months ago?" Sarah's memory was excellent. She recognized the woman as a regular customer, someone who'd come in frequently with her husband. But something about the woman's expression, a mixture of sadness and bitterness, suggested this wasn't a pleasant reunion. "Yes," Sarah confirmed cautiously. "I remember you. You were usually here with a gentleman, your husband." "Was," the woman said heavily. "He passed away 3 months ago. Suicide. He couldn't find work after his company was restructured by Sterling Corporation. He was 62 years old, and he couldn't imagine starting over, so he didn't." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She felt her knees weaken and reached for the table beside her to steady herself. "I'm so sorry," Sarah managed, the words wholly inadequate. "Are you?" the woman asked. Her tone wasn't accusatory, simply tired. "Because I found out you're working for Sterling now. You're helping him build this community center, this monument to his supposed redemption. Do you know how many lives were destroyed by his business decisions? Do you know that he sits in his penthouse while people like my husband are burying themselves in the ground?" Sarah didn't have an answer. She escorted the woman to a quiet corner, and they sat together in silence for a long moment. "He gave me a scholarship," the woman said eventually. "My granddaughter. After my husband died, I didn't know how we'd manage. I'm retired, and my pension isn't substantial. There was an anonymous scholarship, full ride, to her university of choice. The application process was easy. The foundation was called Second Chances. My husband used to say that all he needed was one more chance to prove himself. So yeah, I know Sterling is trying, but trying doesn't bring back the people he destroyed in the process." That evening, Sarah confessed the entire conversation to Marcus. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, searching for the capacity to hold the genuine pain of the people affected by his decisions. "I didn't know about your husband specifically," Marcus said quietly. "There are so many. I've funded scholarships for thousands of children, outreach programs for thousands of workers, and every single one of those initiatives exists because I'm trying to save people from experiencing what happened to your father. But it's like throwing sand against an ocean. There will always be more people harmed than I can reach with resources." "Then maybe the answer isn't to keep making decisions that cause the harm," Sarah said gently. "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "Or maybe the answer is to keep working, keep trying, keep acknowledging that business decisions have human consequences, and I'm responsible for those consequences regardless of my good intentions." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm thinking of changing my approach to acquisitions. I'm considering whether the wealth I could accumulate is worth the human cost." It's a question my therapist has asked me repeatedly, and I've avoided answering. But having a face, knowing that woman's story, it makes the question impossible to avoid. That doesn't fix what happened, Sarah said. It doesn't bring her husband back. No, Marcus agreed, but it might prevent similar situations in the future, and it might represent genuine change rather than performing change. And the foundation of their relationship fractured when Sarah discovered something she shouldn't have discovered. She was searching through Marcus's desk for a document he'd asked her to find when she encountered a folder marked personal. A professional ethics dictated that she should ignore it, respect his privacy, close the folder, and pretend she'd never seen it. Sarah opened it anyway. Inside were photographs and documents dating back several years. The photographs were surveillance images of various women, meticulously dated and documented. Dates, locations, times when the women had been observed. In some instances, there were notes about conversations, about their movements, about details of their personal lives that they'd shared with no one but this mysterious observer. Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew what she was looking at, a pattern of obsessive behavior, stalking of the most disturbing variety. And at the center of the most recent documentation was a photograph that made her knees buckle. It was her own photograph. Her face was captured in perfect clarity, standing outside her mother's assisted living facility. There were dates scrawled in Marcus's handwriting, observations about her arrival and departure times, notes about how long she'd spent inside, comments about her interactions with her mother. Marcus had been watching her. Before he'd ever approached her at the restaurant, he'd been observing her, documenting her, studying her like a specimen in a laboratory. She heard him enter the apartment. He had a key which suddenly felt terrifying rather than romantic, and she remained motionless in the study, the folder trembling in her hands. "Sarah?" he called out, and then stopped when he saw her face. He understood immediately what had happened. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaking with rage and fear. "How long have you been stalking me?" 3 months before we met at the restaurant," Marcus said with brutal honesty. "I saw you one day, and something about you fascinated me. I couldn't explain it, so I watched, I documented. I became obsessed with understanding who you were and how you lived." "That's insane," Sarah said. "That's criminal, that's—" She couldn't find words large enough for what this was. "Yes," Marcus said, "it was all of those things. It was the behavior of a man whose wealth and power had convinced him that normal rules of human decency didn't apply to him. It was the same pathology that allowed me to fire 500 people without truly considering their humanity. I was using my resources to bend the world to my will, and it never occurred to me that I didn't have the right." "Did you approach me at the restaurant by accident, or was that planned?" Sarah asked. She needed to understand the architecture of her own deception. "It was planned," Marcus confirmed. "Every interaction we've had was something I orchestrated. The test with the money, the subsequent dinners, the job offer, the relationship, all of it was carefully constructed to position you exactly where I wanted you to be. And then, something unexpected happened." "What?" Sarah asked bitterly. "I fell in love with you," Marcus said. "Actually, genuinely fell in love. And that terrified me more than anything else. Because suddenly, I wasn't conducting an experiment anymore. I was genuinely invested in your life and your happiness, and that made me vulnerable in ways I've spent my entire adult life trying to avoid." "I don't believe you," Sarah said. "I think you're justifying behavior that's fundamentally abusive." "I know," Marcus replied, "and you'd be right to not believe me. But the truth is irrelevant because you should leave. You should leave this apartment, leave your job, take the money you've already earned and the support for your mother that I've established, and remove yourself from my life. I'm a man with destructive patterns, Sarah, and my proximity to you will only generate more harm. Sarah looked at the man she'd allowed herself to love and saw him clearly for the first time. He was broken in ways that no amount of therapy could fully repair. He was dangerous in ways both obvious and subtle, and he was genuinely, desperately trying to change. The question was whether his effort to change was sufficient to outweigh the violation she'd experienced. Sarah didn't leave that night. She also didn't stay. Instead, she moved into a hotel and spent 3 days in what she would later describe as a kind of suspended animation, neither fully engaged with life nor capable of escaping it. She visited her mother, who somehow sensed the crisis without being told the specifics. "Are you leaving him?" Catherine asked directly, with the clarity that seemed to arise when her disease temporarily retreated. "Should I?" Sarah countered, unwilling to make the decision alone. "That depends," her mother said slowly, "on whether you believe people can change. I spent my entire life teaching people, children primarily, but also adults who came to the library seeking refuge. And what I learned is that change is possible, but only when someone genuinely wants to change and is willing to endure the difficulty of actually doing it. Not just talking about it, but doing the hard work every single day." "He violated my privacy," Sarah said. "He manipulated me. He orchestrated our entire relationship." "All true," her mother acknowledged, "and also true that he immediately confessed when discovered, didn't attempt to justify or minimize, and explicitly told you that you should leave. Those aren't the actions of someone trying to preserve a manipulative dynamic. Those are the actions of someone genuinely trying to break his own patterns." Sarah returned to Marcus's apartment 3 days later. He was visibly exhausted, as though he hadn't slept since she'd left. She sat across from him at the dining table, where they'd shared so many conversations. "I want to understand," she said. "I want to understand what's broken in you that made watching me feel necessary." And so Marcus talked. He discussed his childhood, the instability that had followed his father's death, the poverty he'd experienced before he'd learned to leverage intelligence and ruthlessness into wealth. He discussed his fear of vulnerability, his conviction that allowing anyone close enough to hurt him represented weakness. He discussed the specific moment when he'd seen her at the assisted living facility, standing in the rain, shoulders bent beneath the weight of her mother's disease, and something in him had recognized kinship with her suffering. "I wanted to be someone who could save you," he said finally, "because I hadn't been able to save my father. I'd made a promise to myself that I would never be powerless again, and somehow helping you became a way of fulfilling that promise. But that's a corrupted motivation, built on my own needs, rather than genuine care for your well-being." "What changed?" Sarah asked. "You did," Marcus replied. "Or rather, your continued choice to see my humanity even when I was behaving in dehumanizing ways. You didn't run from my coldness. You confronted it. You held me accountable. And somehow, through that process, I became someone closer to human." Sarah spent the next hour explaining her conditions for remaining in the relationship. No more secrets. Complete transparency about his psychological state, his therapy, his ongoing struggles. Professional help for his obsessive behaviors. A commitment to addressing the structural problems in his life that had created these destructive patterns. And most importantly, a genuine acceptance that he might fail, that he might return to destructive behaviors, and that if he did, she would leave. "I can accept those terms," Marcus said. "Even the part about me potentially leaving," Sarah pressed. "Especially that part," Marcus confirmed, "because it means you're not staying out of obligation or manipulation. You're staying because you choose to. That's the only choice that matters." The following year was perhaps the most challenging and rewarding of both their lives. Marcus engaged in intensive therapy, confronting patterns that had been established across decades. He underwent psychiatric evaluation and was diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder in its most severe manifestation, combined with attachment disorders stemming from his father's death. The medication and therapy were difficult, requiring him to sit with discomfort and resist his instinctive impulses to control and monitor. But he did the work. He attended every therapy session. He allowed Sarah access to his computer and phone. He checked in with her when his obsessive impulses arose, rather than acting on them. He made himself vulnerable in ways that clearly terrified him. Sarah, for her part, engaged in therapy herself, processing her own trauma and understanding how her desperate circumstances and her gratitude had made her susceptible to manipulation. She learned to recognize the moments when love and obligation were beginning to blend, and she worked to maintain boundaries that protected her autonomy. The gathering place expanded to 3 locations, and all of them became genuine community hubs rather than monuments to Marcus's redemption. More importantly, Marcus fundamentally changed how he approached business. He restructured his company to prioritize worker stability and community impact alongside profit. He took significant financial hits, choosing sustainable practices over maximum return. His reputation in business circles shifted from ruthless to principled, which actually increased his credibility and his business success. Sarah's bookstore cafe became a reality. It opened in one of the neighborhoods most affected by Marcus's past business decisions. The cafe served as a gathering place for book club discussions, community meetings, and simply a space where people could exist without transaction. A portion of the profits went to the foundation that had been established to support displaced workers. On the 1-year anniversary of their relationship's breaking point, Marcus took Sarah to the top of the same building where they'd first had dinner in his penthouse. He'd converted the rooftop into a garden, unexpected and beautiful, full of plants and flowers that seemed to thrive against the urban landscape. "I wanted to tell you something," he said, producing a small jewelry box with a kind of nervous humor that suggested his fear had finally overcome his control. "I wanted to ask you something, actually." "Marcus," Sarah said, "are you about to propose?" "Yes," he admitted, "and I'm terrified that you'll say no, and simultaneously terrified that you'll say yes, because either answer means I'm not in control of what happens next." Sarah smiled, the genuine, unguarded smile that had been the thing that originally attracted him, that had made him want to understand her, that had transformed him from someone broken into someone broken but trying. "I'm going to say yes," she said, "but you should know that you were never in control of what happened next, and you're still not. None of us ever are. We're all just doing our best to be honest and kind and to love each other despite our fundamental flaws." Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple diamond, elegant and understated, chosen by Sarah's preference rather than his impulse toward excess. "I want to spend my life learning how to be worthy of you," he said. "I don't want you to be worthy," Sarah replied. "I want you to be human, messy and complicated and continually trying. That's more than enough." The wedding was small, exactly as Sarah had wanted. They married at the Botanical Gardens adjacent to the second gathering place location, with only close family and friends in attendance. Sarah's mother, Catherine, was present, experiencing one of her good days, lucid and joyful, fully present in her daughter's moment. Marcus's estranged family had been invited, and his mother came, seeing her son for the first time in 3 years, with a mixture of hope and caution. "He's different," his mother said to Sarah as they prepared for the ceremony. "I don't know what you did, but he's different." "I didn't do anything," Sarah said. "He did the work. I just refused to leave while he was doing it." The couple honeymooned, not in some exclusive resort, but in a small cottage outside of the city, spending their time reading, cooking, and simply existing together without the constant demands of business or philanthropy. It was there, in that quiet space, that Sarah became pregnant with their first child. The pregnancy brought a new dimension to their relationship. Marcus's protective impulses, which had previously manifested in obsessive monitoring, redirected themselves into more healthy expressions of care. He attended every prenatal appointment. He took classes on infant care and fatherhood. And most remarkably, he talked openly about his fears that he would damage their child as his father's death had damaged him, that his broken genetics and his traumatized psychology would pass on to the next generation. "That's the beauty of awareness," Sarah said when he expressed these fears. "You know your patterns. You'll teach our child to be aware of them too. Consciousness is the greatest inheritance you can provide." Their son, James Marcus Sterling III, called Jamie at Sarah's insistence, was born on a snowy evening in February. Marcus cried when he held his newborn son, tears stemming from a well of emotion that his old self would never have permitted to flow. "He's perfect," he whispered to Sarah, who was exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. "He's human," Sarah corrected gently, "which means he'll be flawed and complicated. But he'll also have two parents who understand that human condition and who are committed to helping him navigate it with as much honesty and grace as we can manage." 2 years later, they had a daughter, Emma, who inherited her mother's empathy and her father's strategic mind, a combination that promised to be formidable. Sarah had stepped back from her involvement in the bookstore cafe, choosing to focus on motherhood while maintaining her role as a consultant for the Gathering Place expansions. Marcus had reduced his working hours significantly, prioritizing family time and his continued therapy. They were not perfect. They still fought. Sarah occasionally felt triggered by Marcus's lingering control impulses. Marcus sometimes regressed into his old patterns of working obsessively, using business as a refuge from the vulnerability of personal relationships. But they had built a relationship based on honest communication, mutual respect, and the fundamental acknowledgement that love required continuous effort. 5 years after the night that Sarah discovered the surveillance folder, the Sterling family, now including Jamie, Emma, and the promise of a third child, stood in the renovated Gathering Place headquarters. The organization had expanded to 15 locations across the city and was beginning to plan expansion into other regions. The spaces had become exactly what Sarah had envisioned, genuine community hubs where people could access resources, build connections, and experience the sensation of truly belonging. Marcus stood at the podium, preparing to announce a major initiative. The room was filled with board members, community leaders, and residents of neighborhoods that had been transformed by the Gathering Place's work. Sarah sat in the front row, their children beside her, watching her husband with an expression of profound love and acceptance. "I want to talk about redemption," Marcus began, "but not in the way that word is usually used. Most people think of redemption as erasing a debt, becoming clean of past wrongdoing, achieving some kind of moral status that justifies everything that came before. I don't believe in that kind of redemption." He paused, his eyes finding Sarah's. She nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Real redemption isn't about forgetting or erasing what you've done," he continued. "It's about understanding the impact of your actions, accepting responsibility for those impacts, and committing to causing less harm going forward. By that definition, redemption isn't a destination you reach and then rest from. It's an ongoing practice, something you engage in every single day for the rest of your life." He described the Gathering Place model, how it had evolved from his initial impulse toward charity into something far more sophisticated, a system designed to address the root causes of the vulnerabilities that wealth could exploit. He announced an expansion of worker protections in his company, a new training program for displaced workers, and most remarkably, a commitment to dismantle the acquisition strategy that had created his wealth in the first place. "I'm restructuring my company," he said, "to prioritize stability, worker benefits, and community impact alongside profit. This will reduce my personal wealth significantly. But I've learned that the greatest wealth isn't measured in currency. It's measured in the relationships you build, the communities you support, and the ways you show up for the people you love." After his speech, as they walked through the gathering place with Jamie and Emma running ahead, Sarah took Marcus's hand. "Are you truly happy?" she asked. Marcus considered the question seriously, as he always did. "I'm differently happy than I expected to be," he said finally. "I spent so many years pursuing happiness through acquisition and control. And then I learned that happiness comes from surrender, from releasing control and allowing yourself to be vulnerable and seen by another person. I'm happy because I'm with you. I'm happy because I have children. I'm happy because I'm contributing to something larger than myself. It's a simpler happiness than I thought I wanted, but it's infinitely more profound." Later that evening, after the children were asleep, they stood together on the balcony of their apartment, overlooking the city that had been transformed through their collective work. The city lights twinkled below them, each one representing countless individual lives, each life containing its own dramas and struggles and moments of grace. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "The time I waited tables, the financial struggle. Do you wish we could erase that and start from a point of greater comfort?" "No," Marcus said without hesitation. "Those struggles shaped you. They shaped me. They gave us both perspective and compassion. Without that foundation, we wouldn't be who we are." Sarah leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly into the space between his shoulder and his chin, as though her body had been designed specifically for this moment. "We're going to grow old together," she said. "We're going to have grandchildren someday. We're going to make mistakes and have to forgive each other repeatedly. We're going to hurt each other and heal each other and continue to choose each other every single day." "Yes," Marcus agreed, "and I'm grateful for every moment of it." The future stretched before them, uncertain and imperfect, just like life itself. But it was a future they would face together. Two people who had learned that true love wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone imperfect who was genuinely committed to becoming better, to growing, to honoring the sacred responsibility of being let into another person's life. The city below pulsed with millions of stories, millions of lives in progress. But in that moment, standing together as the night deepened and the stars became visible above the urban glow, Sarah and Marcus understood that their story, complicated, painful, redemptive, and ultimately beautiful, was a testament to the transformative power of genuine connection. They would continue their work with the gathering place. They would watch their children grow and develop their own approaches to the world. They would face challenges they couldn't yet imagine. But they would face them together, two people bound not by obligation, but by choice, choosing each other again and again in the 1,000 small moments that constituted a life. And that was enough. More than enough, it was everything.